Moscow is preparing for its Victory Day parade like a man hosting a dinner party while checking the windows for snipers. On paper, Russia has announced a short ceasefire for May 8th and 9th. In practice, it has also warned that if Ukraine tries to strike Moscow during the parade, Russia may answer by hitting the center of Kyiv. And that is where this story becomes more than another exchange of threats. If you enjoy this analysis, like and subscribe. Every year on May 9th, Russia marks Victory Day, the Soviet defeat of Germany in 1945. It is not just a military parade. It is a national ritual, a political theater, and under Vladimir Putin, one of the central pillars of Russian state identity. So when Moscow says it will pause fighting around that date, we shouldn't pretend this is purely humanitarian. It is also about protecting the ceremony. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, Putin has approved a ceasefire for May 8th and 9th. But the same statement warns that if Ukraine attempts to disrupt the celebrations, Russia may launch a massive missile strike on the center of Kyiv. That means the offices of government, intelligence agencies, command centers, and diplomatic missions. Now, Kyiv has not exactly been left untouched during this war. But central Kyiv has mostly avoided the kind of concentrated strike Russia is now openly threatening. That matters. Putin has been unusually quiet in public recently. But quiet does not mean absent. There are signs he has been active behind the scenes. Military briefings, contacts with senior commanders, and closer diplomatic coordination with Russia's key partners. Some of that is difficult to verify, so I would not treat every claim as solid fact. But I would treat the pattern seriously. And the pattern is this. Moscow is nervous about May 9th, but also confident enough to threaten escalation. That is an interesting combination. Nervous confidence, a very Russian cocktail. The immediate story is simple enough. Ukraine has drones. Russia has a parade. And Moscow knows that a successful Ukrainian strike on, or near that parade, would be more than a military embarrassment. It would be political theater in reverse. Victory Day is supposed to show Russia as strong, continuous, historic, and unbroken. A drone strike over Moscow during the parade would say something else entirely. It would say, even here, even now, even in the capital, the war can reach you. That is why Moscow is taking the threat so seriously. Governments act on what they believe, not always on what is proven. That is a basic rule of geopolitics and occasionally of bad marriages. The Russian response is now framed as deterrence. Moscow is saying to Kyiv, don't touch the parade, or we hit the center of your capital. In plain English, Russia is putting Kyiv under notice. The interesting part is not just the threat itself. It is the public nature of the threat. For much of the war, Russia has struck Ukrainian infrastructure, military sites, energy systems, logistics, and cities. But it has often avoided saying in advance, we are prepared to hit the political center of Kyiv. That kind of statement narrows the room for quiet retreat. If Ukraine does launch drones toward Moscow on May 9th, the Kremlin may feel pressure to follow through. If it doesn't, it risks looking weak after making a very public threat. That is how deterrence can trap the people using it. Ukraine, for its part, has every incentive to puncture Russian symbolism. It cannot easily defeat Russia in a parade ground contest, but it can try to turn that parade into a security humiliation. This is why symbolic dates are dangerous in wartime. They compress politics, memory, ego, and military calculation into one day on the calendar. Everyone knows the date. Everyone prepares. Everyone watches. And nobody wants to blink first. The mainstream narrative will probably frame this as Russia threatening escalation and Ukraine refusing intimidation. That is not wrong. Russia is threatening escalation. Ukraine is refusing intimidation. But it misses the deeper point. The May 9th parade has become a military objective because both sides understand its political value. Russia wants to preserve the image of control. Ukraine wants to show that control is an illusion. That is the contest, not tanks on Red Square. The story told by those tanks. Putin's apparent silence may be another part of this story. He is not a leader who improvises on camera. He prefers controlled appearances, staged meetings, and carefully managed signals. When he goes quiet, it does not necessarily mean he is doing nothing. It may mean the machinery is moving behind the curtain, and the machinery now points toward Donbas. The battlefield around Lyman, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinivka may be entering one of its most dangerous phases. I would be careful with calling anything final in this war, because wars have a nasty habit of refusing tidy chapter titles. But the geography matters. Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are not just dots on a map. They are the core of Ukraine's remaining defensive position in Donetsk. If Russia can pressure them from the north, east, and south, the Ukrainian defense begins to look less like a line and more like a pocket, a cauldron, as Russian military commentators like to say. It is a dramatic word, also a useful one. It means a force is being squeezed into an area where supply roads narrow, retreat becomes harder, and every movement is watched by drones. The forested areas north of Sloviansk matter too. In 2022, Ukrainian forces fought very effectively in that kind of terrain. Russian troops, heavier and more vehicle-dependent, struggled there. Now the claim is that the Russians have adapted. That may be one of the most important parts of the war that casual observers miss. Armies learn, slowly, painfully, and often after wasting lives. But they learn. Russia in 2022 was clumsy in many ways. Russia now is not the same force. It uses drones more heavily, adapts its artillery, improves coordination, and grinds forward in ways that are ugly but effective. This does not mean Russia is invincible, far from it. It means that calling it incompetent forever is no longer analysis. It is comfort food. And comfort food is terrible preparation for a military crisis. So if Putin has been visiting military headquarters and receiving direct briefings, that would make sense. A leader preparing for a major operational phase would want details from commanders. Not for television, not for the little gold chairs and theatrical maps, for decisions. My read is this: Moscow sees an opening. Ukraine is under manpower pressure. Europe is politically loud but militarily thin. Washington is distracted and increasingly impatient with European dependency. Russia's economy is under strain, but not collapsing. And the Donbas front may be moving into a more dangerous phase for Kyiv. That combination encourages risk-taking. And that brings us back to the threat against central Kyiv. It is not separate from the battlefield. It is part of the same psychological pressure campaign. Russia wants Ukraine to feel that escalation is now becoming more expensive. Then there is Europe. And Europe, as usual, has discovered the fire alarm after the building has already filled with smoke. The American decision to withdraw around 5,000 troops from Germany has triggered worried European statements. Officials are saying the expected things. Europe must take more responsibility, strengthen the European pillar of NATO, step up defense, coordinate better. Fine words. Europe produces fine words the way Switzerland produces watches. The problem is capacity. If the United States pulls back, Europe cannot simply replace American power by holding a summit and issuing a PDF. Modern military power requires ammunition production, logistics, air defense, transport aircraft, satellite support, intelligence networks, command systems, and political will. Europe has some of these things. It does not have enough of them, and it certainly does not have enough of them quickly. That is the word people keep avoiding: quickly. European rearmament might happen over 10 years if governments stay committed, if voters accept the costs, if industry expands, if energy prices don't crush manufacturing, if budgets allow it, and if political systems don't fracture under the pressure. That is a long list of ifs. It is practically a European defense policy by itself. Meanwhile, the war does not wait. If Russia makes serious gains in Donbas by late summer or autumn, Europe may face a very unpleasant moment. It will have to decide whether it is prepared to accept a worse battlefield reality increase support at higher cost, or push harder for negotiations that many leaders have spent years describing as unacceptable. That is not a comfortable menu. Europe's Ukraine strategy still depends heavily on American staying power. If Washington's attention shifts, Europe does not become independent overnight. It becomes exposed, and that exposure will shape Russian calculations. Moscow does not need Europe to collapse. It only needs Europe to hesitate, argue, and move too slowly. That has often been enough. So what should we watch? First, whether Ukraine attempts any operation around Moscow during the Victory Day period. Second, whether Russia follows through if it does. Third, whether the Donbas front around Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Lyman, and Kostiantynivka begins to change faster than the public narrative can keep up. Fourth, whether Europe's response to the American troop drawdown turns into real military spending and production, or just another grand announcement with flags behind it. My suspicion is that the real crisis will not arrive as one dramatic event. It will arrive as several separate developments that suddenly become one story. A parade under threat, a capital under warning, a battlefield slipping, an alliance arguing with itself. That is how strategic shocks usually appear. Slowly, then all at once, and always with someone on television saying nobody could have predicted it. My honest read is this: Russia is using May 9th as both shield, and sword. The shield is the ceasefire, a way to say, we offered restraint. The sword is the threat to central Kyiv, a way to say, test us, and we escalate. Ukraine may see that as blackmail, and frankly, it is hard to call it anything else. But in war, blackmail dressed as deterrence is not exactly rare. It practically has its own parking space at the United Nations. The more important question is whether this signals a new Russian willingness to hit political targets in Kyiv. If it does, the war enters a more dangerous phase. I don't think Moscow wants uncontrolled escalation. I think it wants controlled fear. There's a difference. Controlled fear means making your opponent doubt the cost of their next move. It means forcing Kyiv to ask whether a symbolic strike on Moscow is worth the risk of a Russian strike on government buildings in Kyiv. At the same time, Putin appears to be managing three audiences: Ukraine, the Russian public, and the West. To Ukraine, he says, don't test the parade. To Russians, he says, the state is in control. To the West, he says, your support for Kyiv may now carry higher costs than you expected. That does not mean he is bluffing. It does not mean he is not bluffing either. The trouble with nuclear-era geopolitics is that everyone spends half their time pretending to know where the red lines are, and the other half quietly moving them. So the May 9th parade is no longer just a parade. It is a test of Russian security, Ukrainian reach, Western nerves, and Putin's appetite for escalation. Watch what happens around Moscow, but watch Donbas even more closely. The parade may dominate the headlines. The battlefield may decide the next chapter. If you found this useful, like and subscribe. There's more to come on this. Stay sharp.